June 1944. The Pacific is quiet in that deceitful way only the Pacific can be. A pale horizon, a wind so light it feels like memory. The sea stretches forever, too calm, too wide, as though the world itself is holding its breath. And there, spread across that stillness, rides the most powerful fleet the world has ever seen. Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 7 fast battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Nearly 100,000 men afloat upon a single idea that this war can finally be won. The carriers lie in 3 great groups, their wakes carving white scars into the blue. Each ship hums with its own heartbeat. Deep below, engineers check the turbines, oilers test the pumps, and cooks work through the long night to feed a small city that floats. Above on deck, the crews move in practiced silence, hands black with oil and salt. The air smells of fuel, cordite, and sweat baked into metal. It is the scent of every day at sea, and it clings to them like a uniform. Somewhere beyond the edge of sight, the island of Saipan burns. Marines are fighting inland, carving foxholes into coral soil under a sun that shows no mercy. The fleet exists to keep them alive, to hold back whatever Japan throws across that horizon, and Japan is coming. On charts pinned to wooden bulkheads, lines of red ink creep eastward. Intelligence calls it the first mobile fleet, Admiral Ozawa's last throw of the dice. 9 carriers, 400 planes, the surviving pride of the Imperial Navy. They believe the Americans can be drawn into range, crushed, and driven back before the islands fall. They believe, still in a decisive battle, that same ghost of Tsushima which has haunted every Japanese admiral since 1905. They do not yet understand that time has already passed them by. Aboard the flagship USS Indianapolis, Admiral Raymond Spruance leans over the plotting table. His face is calm, almost expressionless. The eyes of a man who has learned that command means never showing what you feel. Around him, staff officers murmur updates, adjusting pins on a vast chart of the Philippine Sea. Each pin is a life, a ship, a possibility. The air conditioning hums, somewhere a typewriter clatters, beyond the walls the ocean waits. Spruance's aviator, Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher, stands on the bridge of USS Lexington. He's older now, greyer than the photographs from 1942, but his hands are steady. He watches the horizon through binoculars, saying little. He knows what's out there, knows the enemy will come with everything it has left. The only question is when. Night fades. The decks glow under red battle lamps as pilots shuffle toward the ready rooms. Coffee steams in tin mugs, cigarettes flare. The men are young, 19, 20, 22. They talk softly about home, about girls who promise to wait, about the rumour that this might be the last big fight. No one quite believes it. War has a way of stretching promises thin. Down in the hangars, the planes sleep beneath tarps, F-6F Hellcats heavy with fuel, wings folded tight. TBM Avengers crouch beside them, their torpedoes slung beneath grey bellies. Mechanics move between them like priests in a cathedral, whispering to each machine, checking, tightening, wiping sweat from their foreheads with rags that smell of oil. The noise never stops. Hammers, rivet guns, the distant thump of pumps moving fuel, a mechanical heartbeat that keeps the floating city alive. At dawn, the loudspeakers crackle. General quarters. All hands man your battle stations. The voice is calm, almost casual, but everyone feels the change. Boots thud against metal. Doors slam. The air thickens with adrenaline. Radar operators slide into their seats. Screens flickering pale green. Tiny dots drift across the scope. Training echoes, perhaps, or something else. Outside, the sea remains calm, indifferent to what's coming. Over the western horizon, hundreds of miles away, Japanese engines cough to life on Guam. Pilots climb into cockpits still slick with condensation, their flight instructors giving hurried blessings. Many have never flown from carriers before, many have never even fired in combat. But they believe the Emperor watches, they believe this will be their day. At 0830 hours, the first wave rises into the sky. Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo planes, climbing towards destiny. Behind them, ground crews watch until the specks vanish into the sun. Back aboard the American fleet, radio chatter hums low, words like static, bearing, range, altitude. Each carrier's combat information center filters the noise, turning chaos into clarity. The operators are calm, too calm, because this routine has become reflex. Then one of them leans forward, frowning. He taps a bright cluster on his scope and calls out to the officer beside him. Large formation, bearing 280, distance 150 miles and closing. Within minutes, the report reaches Mitscher. He lowers his binoculars, the muscles in his jaw barely moving. Looks like they've found us. He orders the first combat air patrol launched. The deck crews move like choreography. Planes roll forward, engines roaring, the air vibrating with raw power. One by one they leap into the sky, tails shimmering against the sunlight. They climb in spirals, blue wings catching the morning light like blades of glass. For a moment, watching them rise, the men below feel a strange pride, a belief that nothing on Earth can touch them now. They have come so far from Pearl Harbor, so many ships built, so many lessons learned. The Pacific once belonged to the rising sun, now it belongs to the carrier, to the men who fly from her decks. Still, tension creeps through every corridor. Pilots buckle their harnesses a little tighter. Gunners check their sights again. Even the chaplain on Lexington feels it, fingering a worn Bible as he murmurs a quiet prayer no one hears over the engine noise. Far above, in the clear morning air, the Hellcats level out. The sky is impossibly wide, blue fading to white near the edges of the world. They fly in formation, wings steady, each pilot scanning the emptiness for the first hint of motion. Somewhere out there, 400 Japanese planes are coming straight at them. The pilots know it. The radar knows it. The sea knows it. Back on the flagship, Spruance gives the simplest order of his life. Hold the line. No dramatics, no speech, just the calm certainty of a man who understands that sometimes victory is patience. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. The ocean gleams like polished steel. On deck, men sweat through their uniforms. They wait. The stillness is heavier than noise. It presses down, making every creak of the hull sound like thunder. Some close their eyes and try to imagine the faces of home. Others stare at the horizon until their vision blurs. Then, at 10:36 a.m., the radar scopes flare again. The swarm has doubled. 200, 300, 4. The attack is real now, and it is enormous. The call echoes across the fleet. Enemy raid inbound, range 70 miles. The calm breaks like glass. Klaxons howl. Anti-aircraft crews sprint to their guns. The sky begins to throb with the thunder of engines as another wave of Hellcats claws into the air. The sea, moments ago so smooth, is now boiling with prop wash and spray. From every carrier deck, white trails spiral upward, each one a line drawn toward the coming storm. In that instant, the waiting ends. Every man knows the next few hours will decide not just this battle, but perhaps the entire war in the Pacific. The Japanese are coming, hundreds of them, and there is nowhere left to run. The pilots glance at one another through canopies streaked with sunlight. There are no words left to say, just a nod, a hand signal, a moment's breath, and then they bank west into the growing glare. Somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, the sky is already turning red. The first sighting comes not from radar, but from a flash in the high sky. A lone contrail scratches a white line across the blue, far to the west. It drifts, splits, then multiplies, thin ribbons of vapour, weaving together, until the whole horizon seems to tremble. The radio comes alive, the calm voice of a lookout swallowed by static. Many bandits, Angels 20, closing fat. The swarm has arrived. They come in waves, loose and unsteady, sunlight glinting off silver wings. 0 fighters above, Judys and Jills below, the formation stretched thin across miles of air. To the Japanese it feels like destiny, 400 planes sweeping east to crush the enemy fleet. To the Americans watching through their canopies, it looks like a storm of moths flying straight into a furnace. From USS Lexington, the 1st Hellcat Division climbs through 30,000 feet, engines screaming, the sound deep and animal. Their leader, Lieutenant Alex Vracu, checks his fuel and flips the gun switch to live. Below him, the Pacific is a mirror. Above, the first dark specks are already taking shape. He breathes once, steady, and rolls in. The battle opens without warning. One long roar that seems to shake the sky apart. Tracers arc through the blue like red meteors. Planes twist, dive, vanish. For the first few seconds there is no formation, no plan, only instinct. The Hellcats dive straight through the center of the Japanese attack, 8 guns spitting fire. A Zero erupts into orange flame. A bomber shears apart in mid-air, its wing tumbling end over end into the clouds below. Then the formation is gone, shattered into hundreds of individual fights scattered across 100 miles of empty sky. To the men on the carriers below, it looks like a distant thunderstorm. Tiny black dots wheel and flash in the sunlight. Threads of smoke unravel themselves downward. Every few seconds a dull, delayed boom rolls across the deck, the echo of a kill half a mile above. The anti-aircraft batteries open up just the same, bursts of flak marking the upper air with grey blossoms. It's beautiful, in the way that terrible things sometimes are. The Japanese attack formation disintegrates almost immediately. Their radios jam with overlapping calls. Their escorts fall behind. Many of the new pilots have never flown in combat before, and the shock of meeting the Hellcats is total. The Americans dive from above, faster, heavier, their guns mounted in the wings like hammers of light. They strike and climb again before the enemy can even turn. From the carrier Essex, radar operators watch the scope bloom with moving dots. Each green echo tells the same story, dozens of enemy planes vanishing mid-approach. The room erupts in disbelief. One officer murmurs, half to himself, "They're dropping like flies." A radio man writes down the tally and underlines it twice, though he knows the numbers can't be real. By mid-morning, the first wave is gone. More than 100 Japanese planes destroyed in less than an hour. Only a handful reach the fleet, most to be cut apart by flak before they can aim their bombs. A few drop their loads wildly into the sea, geysers of white water rising harmlessly a mile short of the carriers. The gunners cheer, then fall silent again, waiting for the next formation. They know it's not over. Far to the west, new specks are forming. On Yorktown, the flight deck glows with heat. Pilots land, refuel, reload, launch again. The deck crews move with mechanical precision, faces blackened with oil, shirts soaked through. Each landing feels like a miracle, the battered Hellcats slamming down at impossible speed, wings riddled, tires shredded, smoke curling from gun barrels. They taxi clear as another plane leaps off the bow, engines shrieking. The rhythm is endless, land, rearm, launch, fight. High above, Lieutenant Vratiou climbs through a bank of thin cloud and bursts out into open sunlight. Ahead of him, 6 dive bombers line up in perfect formation, oblivious. He eases the stick forward and lets the nose settle. The crosshairs drift until the lead plane fills the sight. He squeezes the trigger. In 12 seconds it's over. 6 kills, 6 burning scars across the sky. When he returns to Lexington, he barely speaks. He just sets the brake, climbs out and looks at the sea for a long time. The deck crew counts the bullet holes in his fuselage. 43. The battle stretches through noon. Every half hour another wave arrives, smaller, more desperate, more broken than the last. The radios fill with clipped voices and static. "Bogey's high, 12 o'clock. I'm hit. Splash one bomber." Some transmissions end mid-sentence, others end in silence. The sun climbs towards zenith, the light harsh and white reflecting off the sea until everything seems to shimmer. The air smells of gunpowder and burnt oil even this high up. Below, on the decks, men load belts of ammunition until their hands bleed. The gunners' ears ring from the constant concussion. Shell casings clatter across steel like rain. The smell of cordite mixes with diesel and sweat. Some men joke to stay sane, others don't speak at all. On one destroyer, a sailor scribbles a note on the back of a ration box. "Sky full of them, none getting through." He tucks it into his pocket as if someone might find it later. By early afternoon, the 4th Japanese wave dissolves before it even reaches the fleet. American fighters intercept them 100 miles out, cutting them apart with mechanical efficiency. The battle has become slaughter, a machine eating itself. Pilots begin to realize they're running low on targets. It's like hunting practice, no one says later, ashamed even as he says it. They hadn't expected it to be this one-sided, this brutal, this final. At 1500 hours, the last enemy group turns back toward Guam, half its planes already missing. The Americans chase them until fuel gauges drop toward empty, then break off. The ocean below is dotted with debris, fragments of wings, oil slicks, parachutes drifting down like dying stars. For a moment, the sky is quiet again. The Hellcats form up, battered but alive, and head home. The radio chatter fades into a low hum of exhaustion. On the decks, crews stand waiting, shielding their eyes against the glare. One by one, the planes return, wheels slamming onto the pitching decks, arrestor hooks catching cables with a jolt that shakes the ship, some land missing chunks of metal, others trail smoke. But they land, and as each one rolls to a stop, the crew breaks into quiet applause that dies as quickly as it begins. It feels wrong to cheer. There are too many empty spots in the formation. As the last Hellcat touches down, Mitscher steps out onto Lexington's bridge wing. The wind tugs at his cap. The sea around him is calm again, littered with drifting patches of oil reflecting the sunlight in colours too bright to look at. He watches the horizon, knowing the day isn't done. The Japanese fleet is still out there, somewhere beyond radar range, retreating west under cover of evening. He knows they'll try again tomorrow, and he knows what he has to do next. He turns to his staff. "Tonight we go after them." The order spreads through the fleet. Mechanics prepare planes for a night launch, a mission so dangerous it borders on madness. But for now, the men rest. They eat in silence, their hands trembling from fatigue, their faces streaked with oil and salt. Some write letters they'll never send. Others stare at the setting sun, watching the sky fade from gold to blood red to black. The sea swallows the light. The carriers turn into dark silhouettes against the horizon. From the ready rooms comes the faint sound of laughter, forced but genuine, the sound of men pretending everything is normal for a few stolen hours. Far to the west, the Japanese survivors limp towards safety. Radios silent, fuel nearly gone. They've lost 2/3 of their air arm in a single day. For the first time, the Imperial Navy understands that its carriers are nothing without pilots to fly from them. The sun that once rose red over the Pacific now sinks behind them, and its colour is the colour of defeat. Back on Lexington, the last light fades. The ocean glows faintly in the moonrise, smooth and endless again, as if the day's violence never happened. But the men know better. They have seen what happens when two empires meet in the sky, and only one comes back down. Tomorrow the mission will continue. Tonight they rest in the shadow of victory, and of what it has cost. The night breeze carries the smell of burned oil across the decks, a quiet reminder that the battle isn't over yet. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of sight, the enemy fleet is still moving, and when dawn comes, the Americans will rise again to meet it. Night descended over the Philippine Sea like a curtain being drawn across the stage of history. The light bled away slowly, the orange of sunset dissolving into a dull metallic blue. For the men of Task Force 58, the sea that had been alive with motion and noise all day suddenly felt still again, eerily still, as though the ocean itself had taken a breath and refused to let it go. On the decks, the heat of battle faded into exhaustion. Mechanics leaned against bulkheads, faces streaked with grime, hands trembling from hours of rearming and refueling under the burning sun. Pilots, half deaf from engine noise, removed helmets and rubbed salt from their eyes. The smell of aviation fuel lingered, mixing with the faint sweetness of the Pacific night. Somewhere, deep in the carrier's hangars, a man began to play a harmonica. The tune drifted through the steel corridors like a memory of home. But there was no rest. In the combat information centres, radar scopes still glowed with faint green light. Operators hunched over their screens, voices low and measured. Out there, beyond the curve of the earth, the enemy was retreating, but not fast enough. Reports trickled in, the Japanese carriers Zuikaku, Hyo and Chiyoda moving west at flank speed, damaged, disorganized, but still afloat. The great hunt had begun. Admiral Mitscher stood on the flag bridge of USS Lexington, the night wind flattening his hair against his cap. Below him the flight deck glimmered, with the faint reflection of the moon. He said nothing for a long time. His staff waited, knowing that the next decision would shape the end of this battle, perhaps even the course of the war. Finally, he turned to his air officer and spoke in that quiet, steady voice the men trusted more than any speech. "We'll hit them before dawn. We can't let them get away." There was silence for a heartbeat. The order meant launching nearly 200 planes into the darkness, a thing few had ever attempted. No moonlight navigation, no reliable radar guidance, and a return flight that would outlast their fuel. They might sink ships, or they might vanish into the sea. But no one hesitated. The men of the fast carriers had lived too long in the shadow of the enemy. This was their chance to finish it. Below decks, the announcement echoed through steel corridors, "All flight crews to ready rooms. Mission briefing in 10 minutes. Pilots stumbled from bunks, faces hollow with fatigue. They gulped down coffee that tasted like engine oil and listened to the orders. Strike targets, the Japanese carrier force. Approximate position 200 miles west. Launch at 1600, expected recovery, after dark. Few said anything. One man wrote a quick note on the back of a photo and tucked it into his flight jacket. Another touched the small medal around his neck and smiled as if to say, so be it. By 1600 hours, the decks of Lexington, Enterprise, Essex and Hornet were alive again. The sun hung low, turning the sea the colour of blood. Planes rolled forward, wings unfolding like iron birds waking from sleep. The air roared with engines, propellers biting into the wind. Launch officers stood at the bow, arms raised, bathed in the red glow of signal wands. One by one, the planes leapt into the sky and banked west, fading into the haze. As the last Hellcat disappeared into the distance, Mitscher removed his cap and looked after them. He knew what he had just done, and what it might cost. "Turn on the lights when they come home," he said quietly to no one in particular, then turned back toward the bridge. The strike group flew into the setting sun. The world ahead of them turned amber, then crimson, then black. Without stars or moon, the horizon vanished. Each pilot flew by instruments and instinct, trusting the compass and the faint outlines of the plane beside him. Radio chatter was sparse, just altitude checks, bearings, and the occasional nervous joke. Beneath them, the ocean glowed faintly in the last light, a mirror reflecting the fire that still burned somewhere over the west. 2 hours passed before the radar operators aboard Essex picked up the first faint echoes of the enemy. The Japanese fleet was scattered, a wounded animal limping toward safety. Carriers trailed smoke, destroyers darted around them like frantic shepherds. The American strike group broke into sections, each diving into the darkness toward the faint outlines below. Then, in the middle of that black ocean, the sky came alive again. Searchlights snapped on, slicing through the dark like blades. Tracer fire climbed upward, red and white arcs twisting across the night. The Americans attacked without hesitation. Torpedo bombers dropped to wave-top height, engines howling, water exploding around them. Dive bombers screamed from 10,000 feet, the glow of their exhausts the only light in a world otherwise devoured by shadow. Through this chaos, a radio transmission flickers across the static. "Hit! Carrier burning. Watch your altitude, flak at 3,000. Going in again, good luck, boys." Voices vanished mid-sentence as planes plunged into the sea or vanished in flame. The Japanese fought back with everything they had. Gunners firing blind, searchlights sweeping wildly across the sky, but they couldn't stop it. One carrier took a direct bomb hit and erupted in a tower of orange light that lit the clouds from below. Another rolled to port, flames spilling from its hangar deck. Destroyers turned to rescue survivors, their wakes glowing like molten silver. For 30 minutes, the darkness above the Philippine Sea burned like a second sunset. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The Americans pulled away, engines straining, fuel gauges hovering near empty. The radio net was silent except for breathing and static. The horizon behind them pulsed faintly with the fires of the dying fleet. Now came the true danger, the return. They had flown farther than any planned mission, and most had less than 30 minutes of fuel left. Navigation was guesswork. Compasses spun erratically. Some pilots followed the glow of distant lightning, hoping it was east. Others flew by the memory of the stars. One squadron leader called over the radio, his voice calm but thin. "No horizon, just black. Keep tight, boys." Back aboard the carriers, it was nearly midnight. The sea was pitch dark, the decks invisible. Officers debated whether to light the ships for recovery, a decision that could expose the fleet to submarine attack. Mitscher didn't hesitate. "Turn on the lights," he said. "Every light you have." It was an order that broke every rule. One by one, the carriers lit up like floating cities. Deck floodlights, signal lamps, even searchlights angled toward the clouds. The darkness dissolved into gold. Men on destroyers miles away rubbed their eyes, unable to believe what they saw. The entire American fleet glowing against the Black Sea like a constellation brought down to water. The pilots saw it first as a faint halo on the horizon. Then, as they drew closer, it grew brighter, until the night itself seemed to part before them. For many, it was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. They throttled down, guided in by that impossible light. Some made it, many didn't. Planes came in from every direction, their fuel tanks dry, engines sputtering. Some ditched short of the deck, splashing into the dark waves where destroyers rushed to pluck them from the water. Others missed the wires and skidded into parked planes. Fires erupted, were smothered, erupted again. It was chaos, controlled, furious, miraculous chaos, but they landed. They came home. By dawn, the sea was littered with debris and drifting pilots in yellow life vests. Searchlights played across the water as destroyers moved in circles, hauling men aboard one by one. When the sun finally rose, its light revealed a fleet that had survived both battle and the night. The air smelled of oil and salt and something else, something like relief. In the morning reports, the numbers told the story. 3 Japanese carriers crippled or sunk, hundreds of planes destroyed, and more than 100 American aircraft lost. Most not to enemy fire, but to the dark. Yet the balance was clear. Japan's naval air arm was gone, shattered beyond repair. The sea that had once belonged to the rising sun was now firmly American. As Mitscher read the casualty lists, he said nothing. He simply stood on the deck and watched the sunrise burn across the water, the sky slowly brightening to gold. The horizon was quiet again, the ocean serene, as if the world were trying to pretend it hadn't just witnessed the death of an empire's dream. Somewhere far to the west, the remnants of the Japanese fleet limped toward Okinawa, smoke trailing behind them like the ghosts of all they had lost. On board those ships, young men stared eastward at the dawn, wondering how the Americans could fight like that, so relentless, so tireless, as if the sea itself obeyed them now. The war would continue for another year, but for Japan's navy, this was the end. Their carriers would never again launch a major offensive. Their pilots would never again own the sky. The age of the Zero had died in fire and darkness. Back aboard Lexington, the crew gathered on deck as the sun climbed higher. Someone brewed coffee. Someone else laughed softly, though no one knew why. The light glinted off the steel and the wet deck plates, and for a moment everything felt almost peaceful. The battle was over. The Pacific stretched out before them, silent, endless, waiting for history to catch up. And somewhere beneath that vast calm, the wrecks of the night still burned, unseen in the deep. The sky above them was clear, washed clean by the wind, but if you looked long enough, you could almost still see it, a faint fading glow on the horizon where the world had been set on fire, and then, mercifully, gone dark again. Morning broke clean and sharp over the Philippine Sea. The horizon glowed with that pale gold that only the open ocean knows, and for a few silent minutes the war seemed very far away. The sea was calm again, polished like glass, as though it were trying to erase everything that had happened the night before. Only the drifting slicks of oil, the scattered rafts, and the slow procession of rescue destroyers betrayed what the water now held in its depths. On the carrier Lexington, the flight deck crew moved like ghosts. Their faces were drawn and colourless, their eyes squinted against the sun. They walked carefully around the scorched patches of non-skid deck paint where fires had burned during the night recoveries. A faint smell of kerosene hung in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of spent ammunition. All around them the Pacific was silent except for the hiss of the breeze through the rigging and the distant cry of gulls that had followed the fleet from Saipan. The tally boards told a story that felt impossible. 300 Japanese planes destroyed in the first day's defence. Another 150 downed during the night's counterstrike. Hundreds more crippled or abandoned on their carriers. In a single 48-hour span, the Imperial Navy had lost the one thing it could never replace: its trained aviators. The pilots who had once terrorized the Pacific, who had turned the skies of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea red, were gone. For the Americans, it felt like the closing of a circle that had begun 2.5 years earlier. The ghosts of the Arizona, the Lexington of 1942, the Hornet, and the Yorktown had been waiting for this day. The men on deck didn't speak of revenge. That word had burned itself out long ago. What they felt was quieter, deeper, the weary understanding that something enormous had shifted, and that they had survived to see it. Admiral Spruance stood on the flag bridge of Indianapolis, a mug of coffee in one hand, binoculars in the other. The morning light caught the silver in his hair. Below him, destroyers cut lazy arcs across the water, their wake spreading in white fans that sparkled under the sun. He listened as a radio officer read out fragments of intercepted Japanese transmissions, Confusion, silence, despair. One phrase repeated often, "No air cover remaining." He nodded once and said nothing. The war was not finished, but one great chapter had just ended. At noon, messages of congratulations began to pour in from Washington and Pearl Harbor. The newspapers would soon call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a nickname that the pilots hated but that history would keep. To them it hadn't been sport, it had been slaughter, necessary, efficient, terrible. In their letters home they would not write of victory, but of faces glimpsed for an instant in the glare of gunfire, of parachutes opening like flowers that never reached the sea. That evening the fleet turned north to refuel. The ocean changed colour with the light, blue, then bronze, then a dark wine red that seemed to stain the horizon. On the decks, men leaned against the railings and watched the sky. It looked peaceful again, too peaceful. They had learned to distrust calm seas. Below decks, the ship's photographer developed film in a small darkroom. In the red glow of the lamp, negatives floated in chemical trays, frozen slices of the previous day, a Hellcat streaking through tracer fire, a Japanese bomber caught mid-explosion, a pilot climbing from the sea, face blank with shock. He hung them up to dry, the film strips swaying gently as the ship rolled. Later those images would appear in magazines, framed by headlines about triumph and superiority. But to the men who had been there, the pictures would always smell faintly of developer and fear. On Enterprise, the chaplain held a short service on the forward elevator. The congregation numbered barely a dozen, a few pilots, a handful of deck crew, one cook still wearing his apron. The chaplain read softly from a small Bible, his voice almost lost in the wind. When he finished, he said, "We thank thee for victory, and we pray that we may use it wisely." No one said amen, but each man bowed his head. The prayer hung in the air, fragile as smoke. Days passed, the fleet rearmed, refueled, moved west again. News from Saipan filtered across the radio nets, the Marines pushing inland, the Japanese defenders falling back. For the first time, Japan itself lay within range of the bombers that would soon come. The pilots listened to the news with the same quiet disbelief they had felt since the battle. The sky they had owned for one blazing day was still up there, infinite and empty, waiting for whoever dared climb into it next. In Tokyo, the shock was total. Admiral Toyoda's staff tried to assemble the remnants of the first mobile fleet, but there was little left to gather. The carriers returned home stripped of planes and pilots, hulks of steel that had lost their purpose. Reports spoke of men weeping openly on the docks, of airfields filled with trainees who no longer had ships to fly from. The Empire's dream of holding the Pacific had vanished over the Marianas, burned away in the red light of June 19th. For Japan's enemies, the victory was a technical miracle. For its survivors, it was something darker. American gunners who had fired until their shoulders bled now found themselves unable to sleep. Pilots woke in the night, hearing engines that weren't there. A few wrote home about it, the strange quiet after the storm, the feeling that the ocean was keeping score in ways no one could see. "It's funny," one wrote to his brother. "You can't hear the screaming anymore, but you can still feel it." The letter never reached him. It was found years later in a box of old papers, the ink blurred by humidity. The Pacific rolled on. Typhoons came and went. Ships were repaired, painted, reassigned. The war machine ground forward toward the Philippines, toward Iwo Jima, toward Okinawa. Yet among the men who had been there, who had seen the sky over the Marianas turn red, there lingered the certainty that something essential had ended. The enemy would still fight, and many would still die. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. In July, the fleet anchored at Eniwetok for maintenance. On a calm evening, a motion picture crew projected film of the battle against a canvas screen strung between two cranes. Hundreds of sailors gathered on the deck, sitting cross-legged in the humid dark. The footage flickered, Hellcats diving, bombs exploding, ships burning. Every time a Japanese plane burst into flame, a few men cheered. Every time an American plane hit the water, the cheering stopped. When the reel ended, no one moved for a long time. The projector hummed, the sea lapped against the hull. Then someone began to clap, softly at first, then louder, until the whole deck was filled with the sound. It wasn't celebrations, it was release. That night, Mitscher walked the length of Lexington's flight deck alone. The stars were sharp above him, 1,000 points of light reflected in the black water below. He thought of the boys he had sent into the dark, Some found, some lost forever, and of the order he had given, "Turn on the lights," it had saved hundreds and doomed dozens, a decision balanced forever between courage and guilt. He stopped at the bow and looked east, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to pale the sky. The wind off the Pacific carried the faint smell of oil and salt. Somewhere far behind him, the fires of war still smouldered. Ahead lay only the long road home. The dawn came quickly, flooding the horizon with colour. For a moment the entire fleet seemed to glow, each ship gilded by sunlight, the sea a vast mirror of gold. Men on deck shielded their eyes and grinned despite themselves. Another day alive, another sunrise over a world that had survived its own destruction. Later, historians would call the Battle of the Philippine Sea a turning point, a triumph of technology and training. They would write about radar, range tactics, and the industrial might that built ships faster than they could be sunk. They would count victories and losses, tonnage and casualties. But those numbers could never capture what the men had seen, the way the ocean had swallowed the sky, the way the world had burned and then gone still again. For them, it would always be simpler. It was the day the enemy stopped coming, the day the fear lifted, the day the sky turned red and stayed red long after sunset. Years later, when the war was over and the carriers were silent, veterans of the battle would gather in halls and museums. Their hair turned grey, their uniforms replaced by suits and medals pinned crookedly over their hearts. They would shake hands, tell jokes, fall silent when names were read aloud. Someone would mention the turkey shoot and the room would change. Eyes would narrow, smiles would fade. The memories were still there, not of victory, but of fire and falling metal and the endless sea beneath it all. One pilot, interviewed in the 1970s, said it best. He sat in a wooden chair, hands folded, eyes distant. It was like watching the sun die, he said, beautiful and terrible at the same time. We thought we were ending something, but really we were just beginning to understand it. Then he looked at the camera and smiled faintly. I still hear them sometimes. The engines, the guns. That's how I know I'm still alive. And somewhere out there, under thousands of feet of quiet water, the wreckage of June 1944 still rests. Fuselages half buried in sand, propellers frozen mid-turn, empty cockpits staring upward through the green light of the deep. The ocean has claimed them all, American, Japanese, friend, enemy, and in that stillness they are the same. No flags, no borders, no sound but the slow rhythm of the tide moving over them. Above them, the Pacific breathes. The waves roll and break and vanish again, whispering against the steel of passing ships. Every generation that sails here crosses over the graves of those who once fought for control of this water, unaware that the sea itself remembers. Sometimes when the sun sets just right, the horizon glows faintly crimson, and for an instant it seems as if the sky itself is reflecting what lies beneath. That is the echo of the red sky, the memory of a battle that changed everything and left nothing untouched. June 1944, the day the Pacific changed colour and the world changed with it.